of us will be staying on the call after the event, so feel free to stick around if you'd like. Also, this event is being recorded, but the breakout sessions will not be. So during those sessions, feel free to speak candidly, but just please honor each other's privacy. Okay, so we're just gonna jump right in and begin with our keynote speaker to get us thinking about this topic, Dr. Sarah Brady. Dr. Brady serves as the Deputy Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, where she leads the outreach and collaboration efforts to connect CCST's network of science and tech experts with state policymakers. In support of the organization's mission to make California's policies stronger with science, she directs the CCST Science Fellows Program, large-scale commissioned projects, expert briefings, and workshops requested by the legislature and state agencies. Dr. Brady earned her doctorate in chemistry at the University of Oregon, and she actually got her start as a CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellow in Assemblymember Susan Bonilla's office, and then was hired on as a legislative director. And we're so happy to have Dr. Brady here, so I'll just turn it right over to her.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today and speak with all of you. And also, it was just really nice to finally watch Picture a Scientist. So I'm appreciative to have had that opportunity as well. It really spoke to me. Honestly, I saw a lot of my experiences and those of my female colleagues in graduate school reflected in the stories that were shared. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about it all today. As Morgan said, I'm the Deputy Director of CCST. I'm happy to talk about all of that any other time, so feel free to follow up. But today I'm really here to connect with you about the work that I did that really started prior to CCST and then kind of continued from there. So my story to tell is really about how I had an opportunity to improve the system for those that came after me. So in particular, related to family leave or lack thereof for graduate students and postdocs, which was one of the sections of the iceberg that they referenced that is hidden under the water in the documentary. So while I was a chemistry grad student at the University of Oregon, I was really lucky to, for a handful of years, be an officer in the UO Women in Graduate Sciences group. And it just was a really amazing cohort of women, and we worked together to create networking opportunities, brought in various seminar speakers to talk about, issues we cared about, career paths. And I think the documentary also highlighted the importance of having that type of cohort and network to connect with while in graduate school. So one item that kept coming up for us, and really that we kept failing to find a solution for, was how to support our membership, our Women in Graduate Sciences membership, and the broader community of graduate students at the university when and if they wanted to take family leave. So you can imagine it's a little tricky for a lot of graduate students, and just speaking from my point of view as a chemist, a lot of my friends, it was especially tricky because we work with some pretty toxic chemicals on a regular basis. And so at the University of Oregon at that time, family leave decisions were left up to the PI. And in some cases, this was great, and the PIs happily worked with grad students to make it happen. In other cases, it wasn't as wonderful. And so fast forward to when I finished my PhD and accepted the CCST Science Policy Fellowship. As Morgan said, I worked for then Assembly Member Susan Bonilla. And one of the main reasons I was really, really excited to get the opportunity to start in her office was because of her track record focused on trying to increase the representation and retention of women in STEM. So she herself has 4 daughters. She was a teacher. 2 of her daughters are scientists. So she was coming at it as an elected official from a really personal perspective. And that really resonated with me, obviously based on my own experiences in STEM. So I was brand new to the office, to the legislature, to policy in general. I mean, I'm forever grateful that I got the CCST fellowship. It really launched me into this career that I've happily stayed in since then. And they do an amazing job of training us on the legislative process and on what it's like to work in Sacramento. But of course, being new, that doesn't mean that I showed up to my office just like full of ideas on how to make change. But what I did have was ideas, at least on issue areas where I thought that the Assemblywoman might be willing to focus some of her time. And so they asked me if I had any bill ideas to propose. And my first thought was family leave. Like, is this the opportunity? Is this the time where maybe I can come up with a solution? And so I had to pull together a pitch essentially for the Assemblywoman to highlight how this problem could be solved legislatively. And so I kind of pitched it in a way that I also saw reflected in the documentary, which was focused on the leaky pipeline. And so I wanted her to focus her efforts with this bill on just one part of the pipeline, right? Graduate students and postdocs. So how do we get more women to finish their PhD and then keep their interest in staying in academia and eventually moving on to tenured faculty? And so really laid out the anecdotes for her and the research that does exist in this field, and convinced her to carry this bill. And so it was a real aha moment for me, where my two worlds were kind of colliding in a really, really positive way, and in a way where I felt like I could take this opportunity that I had as a scientist working in the legislature to make change and make improvements to the graduate system, so that students in California hopefully felt more included and supported as they worked through their graduate programs. So I was really excited for the opportunity, and I was really grateful that I was able to pull together a coalition of supporters. So I worked really closely with graduate student unions, with student associations, with faculty associations, with the University of California, Stanford, a whole group of stakeholders, so that we could come up with a policy that addressed the problem, but in a way that was actionable and able to be implemented. So at the crux of the issue, we focused on the federal Title IX policies, which require gender equity in every educational program that receives federal funding. So it's best known for its impact on athletic programs and making sports more available to women, but it also applies to other areas such as access to higher education and education for pregnant and parenting students. So through that lens, we were able to get a bill passed and signed by the governor that required a few key policy changes for campuses in California. And so it required institutions to maintain a student's place in their graduate program if they took a leave. It required the programs to reasonably accommodate pregnant students, for example, with work that didn't necessarily involve toxic chemicals, or there's certainly a range of accommodations to consider. And it required, I think, most importantly, an extension of time for when grad students had to pass their qualifying exams, and for the total amount of time that they had to complete their entire master's or PhD program, so that the time that they took as family leave didn't count against that clock, that's running, right, when you're in these graduate programs. So we were able to do it together, essentially, and it was wonderful to bring a problem that I had been talking about for many years with many different female scientists, but we never considered a policy solution to the problem. And so getting the opportunity to move into the policy world and really realizing the opportunity that was there was just amazing. So I hope that you're all able to look for those opportunities to make STEM fields more inclusive environments, not just today, right, but throughout your careers, and take what you learned today with you. So I'm thrilled that you've committed this time to talk about this and reflect on this important movie. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brady, for a compelling introduction. Honestly, it's amazing to hear that you were able to bring so many positive changes to the graduate student community, and we're grateful for your efforts. Now I'm going to introduce you to our moderators before separating into breakout rooms and further discussing the film. Our first moderator is Dr. Suveen Mathadahu, Chair of the Material Science and Engineering Program at UCR and the Professor in Mechanical Engineering Department. He also served for 3 years as a member and then the chair of the UCR Senate Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He has been on UCRDI Advisory Committee since 2018. Our second moderator is Dr. Erika Bustamante, who is the Assistant Vice President of the State Government Affairs at Stanford University. Dr. Bustamante served as a board member for Latino Leadership Alliance, a nonprofit organization with the mission of empowering and expanding the voice of Latino leadership and representation in the Bay Area. Our third moderator is Dr. Kendrick Davis, who is Associate Dean for Assessment and Evaluation and Vice Chair of Research, Psychiatry, and Neuroscience at UC Riverside's New School of Medicine, who is joining us today. Dr. Davis has been on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council since its inception at UCR to present. However, his involvement in diversity and inclusion has been an ongoing effort throughout his training and career. Dr. Davis has mentioned that he has been nurtured largely by women faculty, scientists, researchers, and educators. And as a result of that, he has also mentored many more women in the scientific field. Next, we have Dr. Julie Lebarkin, who is a professor of environmental science at Michigan State University, where she runs the Geocognition Research Laboratory. She also serves as NASEM Advisory Board of Action Collaborative on preventing sexual harassment in higher education and its development of academic sexual misconduct database. Today, we also have two incredible graduate students who have done tremendous work supporting marginalized students joining us. First, we had Evelyn Valdez-Ward, who is a PhD candidate at UC Irvine, who does an amazing work in social justice and advocacy, is scheduled to be a moderator tonight, but she's in Texas battling the winter storms and power outages. We hope her and all the Texans to stay safe, so that we are grateful for her, for other organizers, Leticia Meza, to fill out Evelyn's spot tonight. Leticia has over 10 years of commitment in working with and for diverse students. She has mentored over 15 students, served as outreach coordinator at UCR's graduate division, served on UCR AWIS board for 4 years, and is currently working on multiple projects aimed at increasing Black scholarship here and in other university spaces in Midwest. And last but not least, we have Annabelle Lolinko, who is a graduate student in Iowa State University's chemistry department, who serves as the current co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the National Science Policy Network. Just a reminder to all guests that we will automatically now be sorted in the breakout rooms, and you don't have to press anything. We'll see everyone when we return. Thank you.
I know.
It was short.
That's because all the answers to all these questions can clearly be uncovered in a 30-minute discussion.
Clearly.
Well, the hope is that this is just one of many sparks and that everyone continues to engage in meaningful conversations that are action oriented, not only at UCR, but beyond, and including the spaces that policy can improve upon.
Well put.
Yeah. All right, Ariana, I think we can.
Okay, awesome. It is nice to have everyone back. Now we're going to ask groups to share with us a quick summary of your group's discussion. Let's try to keep them around 2 to 2.5 minutes. I'm going to start with Dr. Mathada, who would you please share with us the conversation that you had with your group?
Yeah, you know, it was a short amount of time, but I'll try to summarize some of the key points and hopefully land on some of the things that we as a group felt strongly about. With general reflections on the movie, we thought that this should be kind of required viewing, and that movies like this and documentaries like this carry much more weight than the required trainings that we're forced to go through, because they're real human stories and they're not a box check, and they resonate in very different ways than training does. We talked quite a bit about the role of assumptions, how throughout history people have made assumptions about a PI being a man, or somebody being from a certain country, or somebody being from a certain gender. And that from a perspective of making things more welcoming for those groups, we have to strive towards not making assumptions, but then asking the right questions of those groups to create opportunities to make them feel welcomed and part of our groups, and certainly not stigmatizing many of the things that were mentioned in that question, like orientation, gender, cultural background, what it may be. There was a lot of discussion on issues related to things like childcare and other factors that have historically caused the split in the famous scissor plot. By creating both representation and then opportunities for people to be accommodated when they run into those sorts of family events, concerns, or life events, we will lessen the possibility of losing females and underrepresented groups in the pipeline. And then the students were very supportive of programs that provide pathways for inclusion. One example that was brought up was the MARC-U program, but other programs that allow internships and integration within laboratories of PIs, where they can get the experiences that lead them towards later careers in STEM. I know I'm probably cutting it close to the timing. We talked a little bit about mental health and how a lot of students don't even know that they have access to free mental health resources from campus, which can happen even outside of COVID. Grad school is stressful outside of COVID. This makes it even more challenging.
Yes, that is a great point. We also saw that usually women who are subjected to implicit and explicit biases, they go through a different type of emotional pain as a faculty member, as a graduate student. So thank you so much for sharing this. I'm going to go to our second group, Dr. Bustamante. Would you please share with us the highlight of your discussion with us? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we, in general, agree that one of the powerful points of the film was this idea that we're not alone and that it's important to find allies, right? To be able to get things going and to be able to find support and make things happen. So the concept of having that support and whether, you know, with other grad students or through other programs, I think was something that was very powerful. And we all agreed that was something that was sort of a take home from the movie. We also talked about microaggressions and how they're easy things to sort of we want to put in the back of our head, try to forget, but that over time they can have an impact on our identity as scientists and our sense of belonging. So it's important to maybe also, you know, with your allies, talk about that and acknowledge these microaggressions that people are facing. And we also talk about mental health, right? And the struggles with that and how it sounds like things that UC Riverside has a lot of resources that people can utilize. But I think one of the things that was raised is that it's not just that people are more welcoming about like utilizing those resources, but that I think there's a need for faculty also acknowledging that they are part of the problem, right? That it's great that they're supportive of people seeking mental health, but they also need to realize that maybe there are things that they're saying that could be triggering people, right, to have these problems. So I think they also need to be part of the solution, not just embrace mental health services, right, for grad students. Another thing we talked about, which I think the previous moderator brought up, was also the struggle with people that have, you know, graduate students that have children, and how it's harder for them to find the time to take care of themselves and find allies, right? Because they're trying to cope with a lot of different things. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I guess one of the things that we also at the end talk about was this is not just a problem in science, and it's happening everywhere. And we've seen the effects of COVID that COVID has had on women, and women losing more jobs, right? And what can we do to look beyond for policy solutions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Bustamante. These are all great points that you shared with us. And finding allies, we saw that a lot of women, there's just a stigma against speaking up or talking about the discrimination that they have faced. So definitely finding allies could allow women to speak more freely about the issues that they have in STEM. Next, I'm going to move with to Dr. Lebarkin. Could you please share with us your input about the movie, the summary of discussion you have with your students?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of our themes match themes in from other groups. So one of them had to do with making assumptions, which I think the first speaker moderator talked about. So there was quite a bit of discourse around making assumptions about people when you look at them. So relative to disability or orientation. And then I personally added in relative to making assumptions about groups that people belong to. We also talked about, a few people discussed the fact that the movie itself is quite triggering depending on your circumstances. And so it was quite a hard view. And that's an important thing maybe to remember if you think about it as someone mentioned required reading or watching. We talked quite a bit about identity, and we had some interesting suggestions around policy. So one of them really stems from our discussion of identity, and it was the idea that perhaps one way to make STEM more inclusive, and Dr. Rodriguez had this comment, is to incorporate fully and require that ways of knowing and the history of the development of ways of knowing from non-Western STEM should be part of the curriculum. So for instance, Indigenous knowledge should be something that we learn about routinely, and that will perhaps open us up to other identities. People really wanted true inclusion, and I would say that couldn't figure out how to get that, but that it's not there and we need to get there. And then finally, there was quite a bit of discussion about Title IX and investigations of, say, sexual misconduct, and the fact that universities doing that investigating is a conflict from the get-go. And then there's also a problem when you have people who are tenured. How can an institution deal with that? Because often results aren't seen.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. I think these are all great points because it talks about the power structures that we have in the STEM field. It talks about identity. We saw that a lot of female scientists had to basically diminish their identity in their workspaces because they weren't able to fit in. So these are great topics that we could talk about, and hopefully have future events that we could discuss more freely. Next, I'm going to talk about Leticia here with us. We have two incredible graduate students that have done tremendous work improving diversity in the scientific field. The first one is Leticia Meza. Could you please share with us the discussion that you had in your group?
Sure. So I think the initial reaction to the movie, which is what we kind of first started off our discussion with, was that everyone just felt like, Julie said, triggered. And it triggered emotions of anger, of dread, shock. But at the same time, we had some feelings of encouragement and also pride towards these women who were clearly very resilient in times that, you know, are very challenging. As we all know, that academic careers can be extremely challenging on our person, in any identity that you identify as. We also started to understand the question in a different lens that was prompted from Monica, and she kind of brought up, maybe we shouldn't be asking how the science community can accommodate these identities, but more rather ask who has to be answering this question, right? And so her recommendation was that maybe we need to look at scientific societies and look at them as enablers of some of this bad behavior or helping to contribute to a negative culture. And so we need to start dimensionalizing the question as more broadly to understand who do we start engaging into these questions, right? We know who they're impacting, clearly. That's not a question anymore, I don't think. And then another question is, for some of us, we may not be in the positions that we can reach maybe the professional societies or those funding agencies who help set that cultural tone of how academic institutions can behave. But we all have an arm span, and that arm span, we need to understand who we can impact. And so understanding at the graduate level or undergraduate level, you know, what we can do, if it's something such as joining one of these societies at the undergraduate or graduate level, then that's exactly where you start your kind of imprint. We also discussed that we're looking at a huge cultural shift, right? And unfortunately, we didn't get into this too much, but I think it brings home the idea that we all need to have a common system of values if we all want to subscribe to a cultural shift. But that in itself is the issue. So where does this cultural shift need to happen? And how do we dimensionalize our approach to make that happen? So we can look at what I'll call the grassroots level, which is the institution that we belong to. And then we start looking within that institution and going up the hierarchy and looking at it as a multi-tier approach, where we look at the institution, the funding agencies, the societies that we belong to. And so we start looking a little more broadly and not just immediately within our space. Although workshops are helpful, we also need to kind of engage on a broader scale to look for change.
Thank you
We
so much.
also, oh, sorry, go ahead. No, we can, I know that we're sensitive on time, so we can wrap it up. I encourage everyone to engage in more conversations.
Thank you. Definitely involving more students as well in this situation. I'm sorry I skipped Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis, could you please share with us your discussion that you have with the students?
Sure, thank you very much. And I'm going to literally work with Yelda as she took notes and actually helped facilitate the conversation.
Awesome.
Like Leticia and many of the other moderators, many of the points that have been made have already been stated, but I want to highlight a few things that came out specifically in our session. The implicit association test, wherein during the movie, they're in the college classroom and the professor is actually showing the students how they first have to do this whole test of any term that comes up. If it's male or science, put it to the left. If it's female or home, put it to the right. And she times them, then she flips it. and has them do it again, where she changes the categories that are not from the conditioning that we've all been underneath, to show how biased we all are. And it takes twice as much time and 4 times as many errors. Well, we honed in on that initially, because one of the things that is kind of being implicitly stated here, and we're talking about implicit associations, right, is that we all have these biases. And how do we address them? I think one of the things that came out is that we have, Leticia was talking about values, right, our morals. So we should ensure that even though we're all biased, we have a personal duty and a collective duty to identify when they're actually violating any moral principle and ensure that that's not occurring. So basic principles of harm, if anyone argues about morality and have 2 degrees in philosophy, we can start with one thing that everyone will agree upon, that there should be minimal or no harm done to persons, especially innocents. And so we've got to find a way of not allowing first stereotypes to villainize folks and to allow us to then justify doing harm. Then therefore we're not really violating a principle, because the reality is we're all beautiful and diverse and unique. And so if we stop villainizing folks, I think we'll be all right there. And so I think that's one topic that we discussed. Yelda, was there anything else that you wanted to add? Because I know that there were great points made, and I do not want to dominate the conversation for 2.5 minutes.
No, I think you did cover everything. Yes, and I'm looking at my notes. Yeah, one conversation about the implicit bias is something that we all experience in our lives, and something that needs to be definitely addressed, and by policy or by just culture change that was discussed in our group, creating a culture change to promote, because policy itself may or may not work, or people may be hesitant to take advantage of those policies, but a culture change would be extremely helpful in those situations. So
Thank you so much for bringing this idea. Definitely, I mean, we cannot see a culture change if you don't start with our personal accountability. And I'm really glad that you mentioned this. I'm grateful for your input. And lastly, I'm going to talk to Annabelle. Could you please let us know the highlights of your conversation?
Sure, I'll try to keep it pretty brief since I know we're running a little bit behind, but thankfully with Kat's notes, I think something new and a little bit nuanced to the conversation that we can bring. There was this quote from the movie, "A ton of feathers is still a ton." And we kind of circle around a lot of discussions about microaggressions and the different ways that it can show up. And one of those instances was even talking about the ways that you can submit to journals, and in this specific case, being able to only identify between Mr., Mrs., Miss, Doctor, or Professor. And when you're, an early career professional and you may not fit into those categories, aren't there yet in your career stage, where do you go? Where are you placed? And while the training does help, it's very much sort of just a baseline. And what we really need to tackle are these power imbalances, not just, in California, but sort of nationally across the community. And that the power imbalance isn't just one of the dynamic, but also financial and socially. And so all of these different, facets that impact women's journey into science, and what that could lead, right, get stymied when you have these barriers. And so I think that's a quick and dry summary.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Definitely power imbalances in this time. This was a recurring theme from the conversation we had, and that's something that we would like to address even with our panelists. So next I'm going to give it to Morgan to continue.
Yes, thank you, Annabelle, and thank you to all of our moderators for facilitating that very quick discussion, I know, but hopefully we're all able to take some ideas moving forward and think about these combinations of policy change and cultural change, and hopefully even forge some new partnerships and collaborations moving forward. But now we want to move our conversation inward a little bit and transition to our panel discussion with our UC Riverside leadership to discuss what kind of change we can make here at UCR. So I want to welcome all of our panelists and thank them for taking the time to watch the film and to talk with us today. So today we have with us Dr. Catherine Urich, who is Dean of the College of Natural and Agricultural Sciences and Professor of Chemistry. Dr. Deborah Deese, Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences, the Mark and Pam Rubin Dean of the UCR School of Medicine and Professor of Psychiatry, Dr. Chris Lynch, Dean William R. Johnson Jr. Family Chair and Professor of the Bournes College of Engineering, Dr. Gloria Gonzalez Rivera, Associate Dean for the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics within the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at UCR, Dr. Ertem Tunsil, Associate Dean of the UCR Graduate Division and Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and finally, Dr. Jason Steich, Chair of the Riverside Division of the UC Academic Senate and Professor of Microbiology and Plant Pathology. Just a reminder for the audience that you can engage each other in the chat. And again, we're going to stay on the call, a small group of us afterwards if you want to engage further. But yeah, let's just jump right into the questions. And I'll pass it back to Ariana for the first one.
Thank you, Morgan. So for the first question we have, in what ways does the university push out Black women, and how can the spaces you lead work to eliminate those barriers and work to place equity in Black female scholarship? So let's start with Dr. Urick. Can we have your feedback on this question, please?
This is a really tough question. Actually, all of these are really tough in a sense. Because I think the ways are just so subtle in terms of how academics push out Black women, Black men, I'd just say Black and brown people, as well as women. It's really, really subtle. And it's something I've been struggling with a long time, as my peers have too. And I bluntly, I feel uncomfortable with such a large group really calling it out and saying, here's all the things that academia are doing. And I don't want to focus on the negative. I'd like to focus on the positive, being that we all take a part into keeping our eyes open and understanding how we may be affecting other people, and to really working hard to recognize our own biases and working hard to make sure that we're bringing up everybody around us. So I'm going to leave it at that and maybe hand it over to my co-panelists.
Thank you. Maybe I can ask this question from Dr. Deese. In what ways does university push out Black women, and how can the spaces you lead to work to eliminate these barriers?
Sure, thank you. When we look within the university, not specifically just this university, Black women, and I would say also women of color, are called upon to conform to the majority culture. And one way of being pushed out is looking at the culture that is recognized as the standard. So it doesn't allow Black women and other women of color to come to the table and bring their lived experiences and bring it in a way that it is valued. And I find myself as an African-American woman leader at UCR, taking it upon myself to reach my hands out to these women, Black and other women of color, and all women, I do that for all women, to, for lack of a better word, give them permission to be who they are and to let them know that they are valued. So I think that's the way that we are marginalized. And what we can do as leaders is to look at our women of color who come into the university setting as valuable tools to promote excellence. And we need to promote and understand that diversity is a tool for excellence. And so as we look to attract women, we also should think simultaneously about recruiting and retaining. And that recruitment is a process that you are saying to the individual that you have something that we value and you can be an asset to this institution. So it's an intentional effort of recruitment. And when they arrive, we have to continue that intentionality in terms of retaining them. And doing that, it's promoting them. And also, when I said promoting, I'm not just talking about through the academic ranks, but in terms of recognizing these stellar women and recognizing them through awards and other recognition for what they actually bring to the table.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned about retaining the diversity that we have, because there has been a lot of initiative in making our university and faculty members more diverse, but yet still we see that Black faculty resignation rates were twice of the white faculty members. So maybe I can follow up with this question with Dr. Lynch. In what ways do you think we are pushing out Black women, and how can this thesis you lead work to eliminate these barriers?
I'm going to speak for engineering, and I'm going to borrow the terminology that Deborah is using about being intentional. And I'll tell you some of the things that we're doing for our women faculty. First off, we're failing. I mean, I'm just going to be upfront about in engineering. We know we are failing to bring in and retain Black students. We do well with Hispanic students. We do not do well with Black students. There are many in the surrounding high schools, in the surrounding community. We are working to change this. I have Black women on my faculty, and in engineering, we have too few women on our faculty altogether. In our untenured group, it's almost 50% women. We're getting there, but this is going to take time to move up through the ranks. We are being intentional in surveying, looking at accomplishments as promotion and tenure cases come up, and working with chairs to reach out. And one of the things, this could be our own biases, it seems to be a valid observation. It seems that men in general are more self-promoting and think much more highly of their accomplishments and want to be accelerated and want to be reviewed early and want to get that extra off scale.
Why is that the case, Dean Lynch? I mean, what happens if a college or department initiative for Black scholars does not meet its goals? I mean, setting goals and policies is important, but what is the accountability structure we have if they fail? I mean, I believe you have many Black scholars who are as or even more, I would say, reasonable for hiring.
So let me go back and just, I'll be quick about it. To finish that piece, we're intentional about reaching out to the women and just saying, look, you're doing really well. You should be asking for another half step or asking for extra off scale. We do survey where we are with salaries at ranks and be sure that we are not, for whatever reason, having the majority group do better than the non-majority group. Now, we are very intentional in recruiting about getting out. And I mean, I tell our faculty and chairs, you have to go to the conferences, you have to talk to others, and you have to ask who has women in their groups that are coming up that look like they're going to be superstars. Let's get them out to give a seminar. Let's get them in our applicant pool. And once they're in that applicant pool, they're coming in as top candidates. It is easier still in engineering. There are many more women in the potential applicant pool than there are Black women in the applicant pool. When I look around at my colleagues at different institutions and even here at BCOE, a lot of the Black women are interestingly coming from the Caribbean islands. And, you know, we're failing somewhere in, it may be the leaky pipeline, it may not even be getting Black women into the pipeline. And once in the pipeline, we have to get them through in and recruit. But as I said, we're trying to get this right. And I know we're not doing well. So I am really open to and will put in place any suggestions or anything we can be doing to do better.
Thank you so much. I mean, because looking at the numbers, less than 5 people who are TA or GSR at engineering departments are Black people. I mean, the reason we don't have a great diversity in our applicant pool, could it be because we don't have a great diversity in our undergraduate and graduate population as well? And have you been intentional with that either?
So we're working very closely with our undergraduate student organization, the National Society of Black Engineers. We have worked with, in particular, with the help of Ernie Levisser, who's on my advisory, the Council of Advisors, and Gordon Borns. We have raised an endowment for that student group, and we are working with them to do outreach. We are getting more Black students in. The leadership in that group has taken me to task directly, and rightly so, about, look, if we reach out into the high schools and get the students here, and they're coming from high schools where in engineering, they've gone through the same classes with the same names, but they haven't had as much mathematics back.
Hello?
Them up for failure. You cannot do that. So we're working with the students on their experiences to try to get it right for the new students we bring in. I think we're getting there.
Do we have any initiatives, policies that are initiated by the university itself? So we know that we have amazing student population, we have amazing leadership coming from minorities group, but how about the new policies that we have set in, and how do we evaluate them if they fail? And what is accountability structures for them?
I'm going
and
to
anyone else feel free also to chime in.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask others to step in on that one. You know, could somebody else comment there on policies with respect to specifically Black women and Black students?
Well, we spoke about this a little in our breakout group in terms of policies at UCR. And we do have in the hiring process the statement that all of the applicants must write. And our discussion was about how do we use the diversity statements. And Catherine shared that in her college, they did an experiment where they began to review the diversity statement first before reviewing the other materials. I really like that, because I think so often we do not use the diversity statement as an important part of the selection criteria. And I'm a firm believer that it has a lot of value, and we should. So that's a policy. In the School of Medicine, when I am recruiting for a position, and I give my charge, I say to the committee that I would like you to send a diverse slate of 3 individuals. And if you don't have a diverse slate, do not send anyone. Keep working until you get a diverse slate. And we know that studies across the country have shown that when you have a diverse slate in the final selection, you increase your diversity. So I think as leaders, we should take it upon ourselves to be more emphatic and clear about what it is that we want to do to improve diversity and advance inclusion on campus.
Thank you so much. It's honestly great to have your input on this issue. We would like to know that how we can change the policies that we have in order to make sure that we have a more inclusive environment for Black scholars, since we do see it as an issue. Morgan, do you want to continue with the second question?
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
I just want to follow up on the DEI. I have never written a DEI statement, and CNAS, we have an equity advisor. Her name is Marilyn Fogel. She writes a great blog, and I thought, well, hell, if she wrote it, I should do one too. And after doing that, I realized how intensely personal it is. I just letting this group know, I've been considering now every time I'm interviewing for a divisional dean or a chair, I think I'm going to ask them to write a DEI statement. And I think I'm going to, carefully look at this. And so I'm bringing this up in this group. It's not a well thought idea, but it's one of those things. We require this for faculty, but we don't necessarily require it for faculty administrators. I wonder if we should, again, because I think, it's about culture from the ground up, but it's also the leadership from the top down too. So you need to work on both ways. So I'm just putting this up. So I worked really hard at finally putting together my own DEI statement. It's horribly personal. I don't want to share it with anybody, but it was a really good experience for me. And I was like, after it hit me, it's like, why aren't I requiring this for all department chairs? And certainly for divisional deans or anybody else in a leadership position.
Well,
because we're judging others, we should begin by judging ourselves.
My understanding is that it is required for administrators and leaders. And I know when I was hired as dean, I had to write a diversity statement. But then my peer, Catherine, she was hired a few months before me, and she didn't have to write a diversity statement. So I say it in a comical way, but how did that get lost in the system? So those are the kind of things that we really have to deal with.
Yes, and thank you for this discussion. We do have to move on to the next question. I know we could continue talking about this forever, I'm sure. But another big theme that came up in the film, and obviously through our discussions today, even Annabelle mentioned it earlier, was the fact that most of us recognize that there are groups within UCR and all universities that are more heavily impacted by the stark power imbalances like inherent in academia that can lead to bullying and discriminatory behaviors. And this can especially impact international students, which wasn't really mentioned in the film, but I wanted to highlight them. And of course, Black women, but also those without visible markers of marginalization. And most are not and do not feel empowered to speak up due to these power imbalances. And this kind of ties in with the first question as well, because we're talking about implementing policies, but it should also be about accountability. And so I wanted to ask you all in what ways you can help in your leadership space reimagine and reconstruct the accountability structure for those who do engage in things like bullying and discriminatory behaviors. Dr. Tunsil, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you. So as I was watching the movie, I was also thinking, I definitely noticed the power imbalances, and you know that I like to talk about this actually. I would argue the biggest power imbalance in academia is between grad students and their faculty advisors. It's so entrenched that it doesn't have to be really blatant bullying. There's so much power the faculty member has over the grad student, even after graduation, because the faculty member will likely write good or bad letters, right? That's, it's so, the system is set up in an unfair fashion in that sense, unfortunately. So our best shot is actually to try to minimize this unfairness by, my view is we have to empower the grad students. We have to make sure they understand their rights. They understand that there are resources in the campus. They should understand that they can, without fear of being retaliated against, they can speak up. This is of course easy to say for me, and it's very hard to do for grad students. So I understand all this. So it's a big challenge, but we have to try. So as grad division, we're actually it got stalled for a while because of the pandemic, but we were trying to create this document with grad students, grad student association, which is grad student rights and responsibilities. So just because grad students would see this document, they would stop and think, oh yeah, I do have rights, because it's so much lost, especially in engineering and other STEM fields, I would say, because the focus is so much on actually, let me just find this result and get out of here, essentially, without realizing, oh wait, so I do actually have rights. I can stand up to bullying, and I can stand up to unfair treatment and all that. So we were trying to create that notion, at least. And I just emailed GSA, and we're going to pick up from where we left off last year. We're going to have to finish that document and post it wherever we can, on grad division website. If grad council endorses it, that's great, and all that. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we kept thinking, when we first, recruit grad students, we get them here, we have them sit through orientation, and we tell them about, okay, these are your resources. There's mental health resource, there's the ombudsperson, there's the VPAR, there's all sorts of resources, there's all sorts of complaint mechanisms for you, available for you. But I think I got lost, because as a fresh grad student, you don't think about those things really. You barely try to get used to the institution, the ways of the institution, or the new city, or the new department, new faculty advisors, or whatnot. So we just started as grad division this continuing graduate student orientation, and I think the attendance is, I must admit, we didn't advertise it well, so the attendance is probably not that high, as high as we hoped. But the idea is to make this a tradition and repeat this every year. The idea is for grad students to remember again that they're not alone, that they have these resources. It's everything. They have, there's a food pantry, for example. I wonder how many grad students actually know about this. I bet not many. Not to mention mental health resources, not to mention Title IX resources, the ombuds. Like, I didn't know about these things when I was a grad student. So we have to
I do. Yeah, these resources are definitely, I think, important on one side of things, but I just want to also get Dr. Steich and Dr. Rivera involved in this. So I would love to hear maybe more, again, because these are more on, I feel like, the preventative training side of things, but if either of you have ideas more on the accountability side, because we know things do go wrong. So I'd like to hear if you have any ideas.
Well, let me say first that the issues that we are discussing today is not just STEM. They happen in all the social sciences, and I'm here representing social sciences. So in that sense, we have a lot of commonalities. And I would like to stress the proposition of ERCAM that probably one orientation is not enough, because graduate division does one that is very global, showing the university. But I think the departments, the chairs of the departments, must have also the responsibility of pushing these ideas through. So when you are in a smaller group at the department level, it's much easier to convey the resources of the universities, to talk about examples, to talk about what is permissible and what is not. And it creates a much closer connection with your graduate students. And that is the important thing, open channels of communications. And when you go to a new department, your first channel is your graduate advisor, and then your chair. So these ideas have to sink in the graduate students, that they are not alone, and that they should start with the department when any problem arises. And then depending on the problems that they have, we may go to higher instances. But what I would like to advocate is for a much closer connection to the graduate student, and that must happen at the department level.
Yes, and Dr. Steich, I'm curious, as a kind of follow-up question, talking about obviously empowering grad students like we've been discussing is so important in these connections with PIs, but I'm curious on the faculty side, in terms of engaging in positive mentorship or their efforts in DEI, are these even evaluated or encouraged structurally in hiring and promotion? Does it actually have an impact if you do not follow these things? And yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's something that we are struggling and discussing in a couple of different ways to revise how mentoring is incorporated into the evaluation of someone. Obviously, it's hard to, you can't, at the hiring, at an assistant professor hiring, they won't have had an experience of directly mentoring a student in the formal way, although that it would be good to have that context. But I think also the at promotion levels, hearing directly from students. So right now there is no real mechanism for students, for graduate students, to record something about how their PI mentored them in their promotion files, right? I mean, you could solicit letters, but they're not confidential, and so there could be, and there ought to perhaps be ways that could come in. I mean, there's sometimes there's unintended consequences with when we try to change something right away. So I think that that's part of the discussion that's happening. But I think that a voice of students in that process would be helpful, and I think it's actually being discussed in a way. I think the other thing that you brought up though was in terms of the power imbalance. I mean, I don't want to discount. I want to first talk about the graduate students, right? That we are part of a system that is very patriarchal in terms of academia. I mean, we have a society too, but in academia, in the sense that there's a very male-dominated and also kind of white. The rules have been written by typically white males in the past, and so that we don't have to accept that going forward if we can identify ways to change it. And one thing is this sense that there's one advisor, and that's the person who has all that power to write you the letters, and you might be in fear of that person, of saying something about that. So maybe we should think about how we diversify the mentoring system so that there are ways that multiple people can contribute to that mentoring, and it's less of a one-for-one, right? There's so much of it is about funding in STEM, right? You're beholden because someone's paying your salary. So if there are ways that we can give a broader structure to that, if that means that the dissertation committee takes on a broader role than just kind of once a year meetings, that maybe that would help. I mean, these are ideas. I haven't vetted these beyond some of the things I've read, but I think those might give a little bit more of that diversification of the power structure that might help in that way. And yeah, so I think from our faculty standpoint, I think it's also difficult to move through the ranks and feel that that if you put time into that mentoring, that it's going to be rewarded, right? And so this brings back to your first question. We didn't really talk about all the invisible labor that's done primarily by women, quite a bit by Black women. If there are Black students in the program, they are often they often seek out support, and that effort is not rewarded necessarily to the faculty member who puts the time in. So if we can also account for that and give credit and support it or give resources, that would also, I hope, both diversify and strengthen the people that are going through there. So those are my ideas, but to those questions that you brought up.
Yeah, and I will absolutely follow up with you on some of those ideas. Dean Lynch, I saw you raised your hand. If you want to make a quick comment, we're kind of
quick comment. One of the things that we can and should do is form committees for students doing a PhD early, and establish a culture where that committee is providing the guidance all the way through, and they regularly meet with all of the committee members and give them updates, so that it's not so much a one person, all power, all control. There will be some checks and balances in there. It produces a much better program of study for the students as well. It's much broader.
Thank you. I agree. Yes, because in particular, my program, we don't meet our committee until we're actually in qualifying exams time. So I think that especially would be helpful. One thing I want to mention, we're like pretty much out of time, would be just to think about, which we could stay for whoever is available to stay after the event to continue talking about this, would be about thinking about who the players are in our accountability structure at this university and others. Like, for example, like Dr. Tunsil, we talked about empowering grad students with knowing their rights and responsibilities. So if you're having an issue, who do you reach out to? But in the case of UCR and probably other schools, the person you reach out to talk about academic bullying happens to be a professor. So just thinking about these whole conflicts of interest that are inherently built into holding people accountable who engage in bullying, discrimination, et cetera. So that's something I would love to continue discussing, and hopefully if you have any ideas, throw them in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up with it. But we do have to wrap up, so I'll just pass it on to Ariana to kind of finish out our event today.
Thank
So
you,
thank
everyone.
you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're happy that we had this chance to have an open discussion regarding issues women face in STEM. We encourage you to reach out to us for future ideas that you may have in this realm. We also would like to ask if panelists or moderator could potentially stay for an extra 10 minutes in case the audience has more questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I'm sure we could talk about these topics forever, but hopefully just to get the ball rolling, yeah, I plan to follow up with people as well. So thank you.
Hey, thanks for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Thank you. I appreciate this. I do need to go though, so
One
that's
happy to
okay.
follow
Yeah.
up in any way.
Yeah, if you're not able to stay, no worries. Yeah.
I want to ask Catherine a quick question. Would the deans
yes.
be open to receiving some recommendations from graduate students who are currently working on understanding these issues and what the possible solutions would be towards these issues?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone is sticking around and has a question, feel free to unmute. Otherwise, I mean, of course, I have more thoughts, but I want to open it up to someone else first. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, you're free to leave, Dr. Steich, if you need to. Thank you.
Do we want to continue recording for this kind of follow-up stuff?
I guess not. We can probably stop it.